Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, our mission is, well, it's perhaps the most formidable one we've ever attempted. We are going to traverse the entire chronological sweep of Indian history.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is. We're talking about the journey from the very first human presence on the subcontinent all the way to the moment independence was declared.
It's an exercise in scale, really. When you look at the source material, you realize we're covering nearly 73,000 years of human activity. And to make sense of it, we have to segment it into these distinct periods: prehistoric, bronze, iron, classical, medieval, and then, of course, modern.
Right, to give you, the listener, a solid chronological framework.
Exactly. It's the only way to grasp the sheer scope of it all.
And the goal here isn't just to list a bunch of dates. It's really to provide a kind of shortcut to understanding these colossal cycles of collapse and renewal that you see over and over again.
Yes, we want to show how each successive imperial peak, whether you're talking about the Maurya Empire or later the Mughal Empire, set the unavoidable geopolitical and cultural stage for whatever came next.
All the way up through the cataclysmic events of the 1947 partition. It's almost a study in historical momentum, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it. And we're going to start at the absolute deepest end of that timeline, establishing the very foundations.
So we're jumping straight into the prehistoric and Bronze Ages.
We are tracing that transition from early man all the way to the first great cities.
This first segment, it covers roughly 73,000 BCE to about 600 BCE. That's just a massive, almost incomprehensible gulf of time. So how do our sources even begin to anchor the arrival of the earliest human populations?
It's a great question. The timeline is it's primarily based on anthropological and genetic evidence. Anatomically modern humans, originating from Africa, arrived on the subcontinent in several ways.
And we have a date range for that.
We do. It's between 73,000 and 55,000 years ago. This initial colonization is confirmed by shared Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA markers you can trace across South Asia today.
So it really gives you a sense of this immense antiquity long before any kind of settled life even began.
Absolutely. It puts India right at the heart of those great early human migration routes. But you're right, the earliest specific human remains date back to only 30,000 years ago.
Still an incredible amount of time. But the real chronological pivot, the shift in human behavior, that comes much, much later with sedentariness. When does settled, non-nomadic life actually begin to take hold?
That crucial shift begins around 7,000 BCE. The single most important marker for this, I would say, is the Mehrgar culture.
In Balochistan, right.
In Balochistan, yes. This was an agricultural settlement that flourished for an incredibly long time, between 7,000 and 2,600 BCE. I mean, think about that stability. This community was already experimenting with domesticating crops like wheat and barley.
And they had sophisticated architecture too, didn't they?
They did. They were building mud brick houses, developing pottery, even early metallurgy.
Yeah.
And that successful model of settled life, it provided the social stability needed for the next massive leap forward.
Which is urbanization.
Urbanization, which brings us squarely into the Bronze Age and what historians call the first urbanization, the Indus Valley Civilization, or IVC.
Its peak, its flourishing period, is usually dated between 2500 BCE and 1900 BCE. When we say flourishing, what are the signature characteristics that make this period so important, on a global timeline?
The IVC stands out for its technological sophistication and its remarkable political stability, especially when you compare it to contemporaneous societies in Egypt or Mesopotamia. We see these highly developed urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa.
And what's fascinating is the planning, right?
The planning is extraordinary. You have standardized town planning, perfect grid systems, uniform brick sizes across these vast distances.
Which suggests some kind of powerful, centralized authority.
It has to. An authority capable of managing these incredibly complex public works. I mean, we're talking about highly advanced municipal sanitation, including sophisticated water management and drainage systems. This is not ad hoc building.
Yet, the most significant chronological event for the IVC is, sadly, its end. Its decline seems abrupt, and by the early second millennium BCE, those great cities were largely abandoned. What happened? What caused this massive synchronized collapse?
The evidence points very strongly toward an environmental crisis. Beginning early in the second millennium BCE, the region was struck by a period of persistent, really severe drought.
A climate event.
A major climate event. And this climatic stress fundamentally undermined the agricultural surplus that you absolutely need to sustain those massive urban populations.
So the people didn't just vanish.
No, not at all. They scattered. They moved eastward and southward, which led to the decentralization that we now call the late Harappan culture from about 1900 to 1300 BCE. So the first great centralized power in India was, well, it was literally broken by climate change.
So we see the technology and the administration of the Bronze Age just collapsing, which forces this huge demographic redistribution. And that chronological shift brings us directly into the Iron Age and the beginning of the Vedic period, starting around 1500 BCE.
That's right. And this is when a new population group, the Indo-Aryans, enters the scene.
How does that happen?
The sources indicate that Indo-Aryan tribes began migrating into the Punjab region from Central Asia, starting around 1900 BCE. It was likely facilitated by the collapse of the IDC, which, opened up all these ecological niches for them.
And this migration kicks off the Vedic period.
It does. It leads into the early Vedic period from about 1500 to 1000 BCE, and then the later Vedic period from about 1000 to 600 BCE.
What are the key chronological developments that emerge from that new cultural framework? I mean, what defines this era?
The fundamental development is ideological and social. This era is defined by the composition of this extensive collection of liturgical texts known as the Vedas.
These were orally transmitted at first?
Initially, yes, composed in Vedic Sanskrit,
Yeah.
and they provide the earliest literary framework for what would become Hindu traditions. But socially, the most enduring change was the initial stratification of society.
Okay, let's pause on that stratification because it's a concept that carries through for millennia. The sources mention the Varna system evolving into the Jati system. Can you quickly clarify those concepts for us?
Of course, the early Vedic society developed the Varna system, which literally means color or class. It divided society broadly into 4 functional groups. You had the priests, the brahmanas, the warriors or kshatriyas, the commoners, vaishyas, and the servants, the shudras.
And was this system rigid from the start?
Well, theoretically, it was based on function and skill, and initially there seems to have been some flexibility. But as society became more complex and agriculture-focused in the Iron Age, that system started to crystallize.
And it evolved into the Jati system.
It did. Jati literally means birth, and this system became highly rigid, based primarily on birth and occupation, eventually forming thousands of distinct subgroups. This chronological transition from a somewhat fluid class system to a rigid, birth-based structure is, I would argue, the most impactful social shift of the entire Vedic period.
So we've transitioned from these technologically advanced but environmentally fragile IVC cities
Right.
to these decentralized, text-focused, and increasingly socially stratified agricultural communities, which eventually established the Kuru Kingdom around 1200 BCE. It's a complete refoundation of society.
A complete refoundation.
Yeah.
And that cultural foundation now brings us to the next great chronological chapter, the second urbanization, which dramatically reshaped the political map starting around 600 BCE.
Okay, so if the first urbanization was driven by the Indus River and, Bronze Age technology, what was the engine for the second wave of city formation?
It was driven by 2 things, political consolidation and the expansion of iron technology across the Indo-Gangetic Plain. You have these smaller realms, or Janapadas, and they begin to consolidate their territory into 16 major Mahajanapadas, which literally means great states,
So it's a shift from a tribal organization to
clearly defined territorial states. And this generated the first true sustained rivalry among kingdoms on the subcontinent.
And this intense consolidation also fueled a kind of intellectual ferment, didn't it? It led to the rise of new philosophical movements that would also go on to define global history.
Precisely. This period saw the rise of the Shramana movement, which is these wandering ascetic traditions. And we see 2 major global faiths emerge from this context.
Jainism and Buddhism?
Jainism, propagated by Mahavira, who the sources estimate died around 527 BCE, and of course Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. These movements arose in direct opposition to the ritualism of the Vedic tradition.
And they offered a different path.
A very different path.
Right.
They offered paths to salvation based on ethics and individual conduct, not just ritual.
And it's important to note the depth of these beliefs. I mean, while the Buddha and Mahavira were contemporaries, Jain tradition holds that their theology traces back through 23 previous spiritual teachers, the Tirthankaras.
Absolutely. Which highlights that the movement's philosophical roots run deep into the Iron Age, long before this political consolidation we're talking about.
So this internal growth was happening, but it was also accompanied by external pressure. The sources mention the Iranian and Macedonian invasions in the 6th century BCE.
Yes. Now, these were limited intrusions, but they established a really important precedent. The western frontier was now vulnerable, and that forced the Mahajanapadas to start thinking about coordinated defense for the first time.
Which sets the stage for the rise of the most dominant Mahajanapada of all, Magadha. How does Magadha manage to absorb its rivals and become the engine of empire?
Magadha, which was centered on the rich iron-bearing regions of what is now Bihar, was just.
Yeah.
It was strategically and economically superior to its rivals. We can trace its ascent through early ruling dynasties like the Haryanka and the Shaishunaga,
And then the Nandas.
then the highly centralizing Nanda Empire from about 345 to 322 BCE. This entire chronological sequence just sets the stage perfectly for the first true subcontinental empire.
The Maurya dynasty, ruling from 322 to 185 BCE. The first true pan-Indian empire. What enabled Chandragupta Maurya to seize power right after Alexander the Great's campaigns?
It's a fantastic story. The sources reveal that Alexander's campaign, though he never conquered Magadha itself, created a massive political vacuum in the northwest. And Chandragupta Maurya brilliantly exploited this instability, overthrowing the Nanda Empire.
But the Mauryas didn't just conquer, did they? They built something.
Oh, they built an incredible state. They established a highly organized, centralized administration, which is often attributed to Chandragupta's brilliant advisor, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya.
And their power really culminates with Ashoka the Great. What defines his legacy on this chronology?
Ashoka's reign is defined by a huge philosophical pivot after the devastating Kalinga War, around 260 BCE. The sheer trauma of that war led him to embrace Dhamma, or righteousness, and he became a massive patron of Buddhism.
And his legacy is literally written in stone.
It is. It lies in his edicts. These inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars all across the subcontinent. They are key chronological documents because they demonstrate the sheer geographical reach of his empire and his administrative control. His empire effectively defined the geographical limits of what we would call India for centuries to come.
But after the Mauryas, the chronology fractures again. This brings us into the early classical period, from about 200 BCE to 320 CE. What happens in the political center?
The center shrinks. In the north, the Shunga Empire follows the Mauryas, from about 185 to 73 BCE. They established this tradition of royal sponsorship for Sanskrit learning and art, maintaining important cultural traditions.
And they're followed by the Kandas.
Yes, the brief Kamba dynasty. This whole sequence shows repeated attempts to restore political order in the Magadha heartland, but always on a much smaller scale than the Mauryas.
Meanwhile, history isn't just happening in the north. We need to track the southern contemporaries. What defined the chronology of the Deccan during this period of northern power vacuum?
The critical Deccan power was the Satavahana Empire, which lasted from about 230 BCE to 224 CE. They actually started out as Mauryan feudatories, but they declared independence early in the 2nd century BCE.
And they were a massive empire in their own right.
Geographically immense. They bridged the north and the south, and critically, they were a major naval and trading power. We know this because their coins, which are often found in coastal trading centers, frequently depict Indian ships.
So they were outward-looking.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And they were crucial in defending the Deccan against incursions from Central Asian tribes like the Sakas and Yavanas, maintaining stability in the entire southern half of the subcontinent.
This overlapping timeline then sets up a massive network of global connections, and that specifically involves the Kushan Empire in the northwest.
Yes, the Kushans, from about 30 to 375 CE, who expanded into northwest India from what's now Afghanistan. Their importance is purely geoeconomic and chronological. They acted as the crucial intermediary.
Linking what to what?
Successfully linking the maritime trade routes of the Indian Ocean, where the Satavahanas were dominant, with the vast Silk Road network that traversed Central Asia.
And that economic and political stability, that's what created the so-called Pax Kushana.
Exactly. This period of peace allowed for this enormous flourishing of trade and culture, particularly in the fusion of Greek, Iranian, and Indian artistic traditions. This gave us the distinct Gandhara and Mathura schools of art.
And the Kushan Emperor Kanishka was a significant patron of Buddhism.
A huge patron. He hosted the Fourth Buddhist Council, and he's often compared to his second Ashoka, which just shows how deeply integrated this foreign dynasty became into the chronological and cultural tradition of Indian kingship.
And at the same time, the Deep South, far from the Mauryan or Kushan centers, was experiencing its own golden age, the Sangam period.
Yes, this period is traditionally dated from about 300 BCE to 300 CE, and it marks the dominance of the Tamil-speaking region Tamilakam by the three crowned kings, the Chera, Chola, and Pandya dynasties.
Their political history is complex, marked by continuous rivalries, but their literary output is what really defines the era.
It is. The sources emphasize the vast scope of the literary timeline, stretching from the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE.
What's the chronological significance of the surviving works? I mean, what do they tell us?
The oldest surviving document is the Tolkappiyam. It's a treatise on grammar and poetics, likely dating to the 1st to 2nd century BCE. That alone makes it a crucial anchor for the chronology of South Indian culture.
And there were other massive collections.
Huge collections. The 8 anthologies and the 10 collections are contemporaneous with the early Roman trade, and later you get the great epics like Silappatikaram and Manimekalai, which preserve deep historical and religious details of the era.
But much like the IVC faced that environmental collapse, the Sangam period saw its own political decline toward the end of the 3rd century AD.
It did. And this decline led to the occupation by a group called the Kalabras from about 300 to 600 AD. Traditional historians often referred to this as a dark age or an interregnum. It was a disruptive 300-year period where literary and imperial output slowed dramatically before the powerful Pallavas, and later the Pandyas reestablished stability in the south.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the definitive zenith of the classical age, closing out this entire period, the Gupta Empire.
The Gupta Empire, from about 240 to 550 CE, really defines the Indian classical tradition. While the Mauryas were defined by their vast centralized administration and their rock edicts, the Guptas are known for their incredible cultural achievements.
This is when we get the concept of zero.
The concept of zero, the decimal system, Aryabhata's astronomy, sophisticated medical texts. It's a true golden age of science and art. But it's important to note that their political administration was often more decentralized than the Mauryas.
So they allowed more regional autonomy.
Exactly, while still maintaining stability and, crucially, patronage for the arts and sciences.
A stable, wealthy, and culturally innovative decentralized empire. What about their contemporaries in the Deccan?
The Vakataka Empire, from about 250 to 500 CE, ruled concurrently. They acted as cultural rivals and sometimes allies to the Guptas. The Vakatakas were key patrons of Mahayana Buddhism and are best known for commissioning and supporting the final phase of the Ajanta caves,
which are a visual record of the era.
A stunning visual record of the era's artistic and religious sophistication. And then the period closes with the Empire of Harsha in the 7th century CE, which was a final, brilliant attempt at consolidating the north before the political landscape fragments irrevocably into the medieval era.
So the collapse of that Gupta Harsha period marks the chronological dividing line for the early medieval period, from roughly 650 to 1200 CE. And the key defining feature here is the complete lack of a single imperial center.
That's absolutely right. Instead of a single emperor, what you have is a collection of regional superpowers continuously vying for control. And the most defining chronological event of this entire period is what's known as the Tripartite struggle.
And this lasted for a very long time.
Over 2 centuries. From approximately 760 to 973 CE.
So what were these powers fighting over, and who were the main participants?
The participants were the Pratihara dynasty, the Rashtrakuta dynasty, and the Pala dynasty. And they were all fighting for control over one city, Kanash.
Why Kanash?
Because it had been the capital of Harsha's empire. It had immense symbolic value, you see. So controlling it meant you had political legitimacy in the north. But this constant three-way struggle, it just sapped the resources of these massive kingdoms.
And ultimately weakened the entire region.
Just before sustained external threats arrived on the scene.
Speaking of external threats, before we get to the north, let's look south. The sources point out some remarkably successful dynasties that flourished during this period of northern fragmentation.
The south demonstrates incredible continuity, specifically with the Chola dynasty, which flourished from about 848 to 1251 CE. Historians frequently describe the Cholas as the most successful dynasty since the Guptas.
And their power peaked under Rajaraja I.
Around 985 CE, yes. And unlike their northern counterparts who were obsessed with continental land, the Cholas looked outward. They looked to the sea.
That's a massive insight into their chronology.
Yeah.
What was the impact of the Cholas' outward maritime focus?
The Cholas developed a powerful navy, and they used it to completely dominate the Bay of Bengal. They controlled key maritime trade routes and even launched successful naval expeditions against the Srivijaya kingdom in what is now Indonesia.
So they are a vital chronological anchor for understanding ancient global trade.
They are. They demonstrate that for several centuries, Indian political power extended far, far beyond the subcontinent itself.
Now we have to shift back to the north to trace the arrival of those external pressures that will define the late medieval period from about 1200 to 1526 CE, while limited Arab invasions occurred in Sindh as early as the 8th century.
It's the later, more devastating invasions that really changed the course of the timeline.
We're talking about Mahmud Ghazni.
Yes, the invasions led by Mahmud Ghazni starting in the late 10th century. These raids were incredibly destructive. They were primarily seeking wealth rather than permanent conquest, but they repeatedly demonstrated the vulnerability of those fractured northern kingdoms.
And that set the precondition for the establishment of a lasting Indo-Islamic state.
Which arose in 1206 with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. And this wasn't a single dynasty, but a succession of 5 established by Central Asian Turks.
A highly dynamic political system.
Very much so. It starts with the Mamluk dynasty, followed by the expansionist Khalji dynasty, which notably conquered much of central India and forced many southern kingdoms into vassal status. Then came the Tughlaqs,
who suffered that critical chronological setback of Timur's invasions in the late 14th century.
a devastating invasion. It severely weakened the Sultanate, which then just sort of faded through the Sayyid and Lodi dynasties. And as that central power fractured, this vacuum allowed for indigenous kingdoms to rise. It established the Great Hindu Resistance.
And the greatest example of that is the Vijayanagara Empire.
Without a doubt. Founded in 1336 by Harihara and Bukaraya in the south, it was founded explicitly to counter the continuous southern push of the Sultanate powers. For 2.5 centuries, this empire was an economic, military, and cultural powerhouse.
A bulwark against northern dominance.
It was. But its power declined very rapidly after the Battle of Talikota in 1565.
And that battle was a catastrophic turning point.
Absolutely. Vijayanagara was defeated by the combined armies of the Deccan Sultanates. And although the empire nominally lasted until 1646, it never recovered its pan-southern dominance after 1565. The sources remind us that even the Pandyan Empire, which was a contemporary in the far south, lasted almost as long until 1618 CE.
So we see this political turmoil throughout the entire medieval era, but what threads of cultural continuity or synthesis emerge beneath all this constant dynastic change?
It's a great point because this political instability paradoxically fostered profound cultural and religious integration. This era saw the flourishing of the Bhakti movement, led by figures like Kabir, Guru Nanak,
The founder of Sikhism.
the founder of Sikhism, yes, and Mirabai, alongside the Sufi movement. They challenged rigid religious orthodoxies, they emphasized devotion or bhakti over ritual, and they promoted equality and tolerance. Chronologically, this synthesis prepared the cultural ground for the coming Mughal Empire, which was built on a premise of cultural accommodation.
We now enter the early modern period, defined by the Mughal dynasty, which was founded in 1526 CE after the First Battle of Panipat. This marked the chronological end of the Delhi Sultanate.
The founder was Babur, who ruled from 1526 to 1530. His son, Humayun, struggled early on, briefly losing the empire to the Afghan Sur interregnum. It really shows just how fragile the dynasty was in its first 3 decades.
Stability arrived with Akbar, the greatest of the Mughal emperors, who reigned from 1556 to 1605. What systems did he put in place that cemented Mughal control for the next century?
Akbar was a masterful administrator and synthesizer. He established the Mansabdari system, which was a hierarchical military and administrative framework. Every noble or officer, the Mansabdar, was assigned a rank based on his troop commitment.
Which streamlined military command.
And it ensured that the loyalty of the aristocracy was tied directly to the emperor himself.
And what about culturally? What was his big innovation?
His ideological innovation was Sulikul, which means universal peace. This policy promoted tolerance and cultural synthesis. He removed the highly controversial jizya tax, and he incorporated Hindu and Persian nobles into the highest levels of the administration. This inclusive approach was really the secret to the Mughals' long-term political legitimacy.
After Akbar consolidated the empire, the dynasty entered its renowned golden age with his successors. Jahangir was a massive patron of art.
Oh, absolutely. Jahangir oversaw the zenith of Mughal miniature painting. His reign is also chronologically significant because it marks the initial, persistent contact with European powers, notably the English East India Company.
And he's known for the justice chain.
He is. There's a Jir-Aya law, which citizens could supposedly ring directly to get the emperor's attention.
His son, Shah Jahan, then defined the architectural high point.
Shah Jahan transformed the landscape. He moved the capital to Shah Jahanabad, which is now Old Delhi, and built the Red Fort. Of course, his reign is immortalized by the Taj Mahal.
Which, beyond being an architectural marvel, represents the massive economic wealth and technological capability of the empire at its absolute peak.
It really does. It demonstrates its status as a global manufacturing powerhouse.
Yet, this chronological high point is also where our sources identify the critical seeds of decline, and they're personified by Aurangzeb.
Aurangzeb, who reigned from 1658 to 1707, achieved the largest geographical empire India had ever seen. It stretched all the way down to the southern tip. That was the zenith of territorial power.
But that expansion came at a cost.
An unsustainable cost. His protracted campaigns in the Deccan lasted for decades, and they just drained the imperial treasury, diverting focus and resources from the heartland.
And his policy shift was crucial.
Crucially, he reversed Akbar's policy of religious accommodation. Most notably, he reimposed the jizya tax. This alienated powerful regional elites, and it fueled resistance movements, particularly the Marathas, who were beginning to organize effectively under leaders like Shivaji. So, while Aurangzeb is the last great Mughal emperor, his actions set the definitive timeline for the empire's rapid post-1707 collapse.
Aurangzeb's death in 1707 is, you could argue, the single most important chronological marker in the transition from the medieval to the modern era. The Mughal center disintegrates, and the 18th century becomes a political free-for-all.
It truly is a pivotal time. As the Mughal center just accelerated its collapse, powerful regional states emerged, often challenging each other fiercely. Historians debate whether this period was one of pure chaos.
But our research confirms it was a time of massive regional creativity and state building.
It was. The old narrative of anarchy is a bit simplistic.
Our sources categorize these new states brilliantly into three types: successor states, new or insurgent states, and independent states. Let's start with the successor states, where Mughal governors basically transformed into autonomous rulers.
The classic examples are Hyderabad, Awadh, and Bengal. Hyderabad was established by Nizam-ul-Mulk in 1724. He was appointed Mughal governor, but he effectively asserted autonomy, running the region as his own state.
But it's key to note that these rulers, while independent, often still sought the Mughal emperor's sanction for legitimacy.
That's a crucial point. It demonstrates how slowly that symbolic authority waned. They were independent in practice, but not yet in name.
And Awadh followed a similar timeline. Sadat Khan Burham-ul-Mulk made Awadh independent after 1722, but the chronological turning point for Awadh comes later, in 1764.
That's the Battle of Buxar. When the third Nawab of Awadh, Shuja-ud-Dowlah, lost that battle against the British East India Company, it didn't just cost him territory. It marked the beginning of direct British political and financial influence over his state.
It effectively reduced it to a dependent buffer zone.
Exactly. And Bengal was the first to fall entirely, defining the path of British ascent.
Bengal was the economic powerhouse of the Mughal Empire.
It was the richest province. Its Nawabs were wealthy and powerful until 1757, when Siraj-ud-Dowlah was defeated at Plassey by Robert Clive. This gave the EIC immediate military dominance.
And then, after Buxar in 1764, the Mughal emperor granted the EIC the Diwani rights.
The Diwani rights for Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa.
That's a crucial nugget of knowledge. Can we unpack Diwani rights for the listener?
Absolutely. Diwani means the right to collect revenue and administer civil justice. So the EIC now had the power to tax millions of people in Bengal and use that money to fund their commercial activities.
But, and this is the core of the political disaster, the Nawab was still officially in charge of Nizam.
Criminal justice and administration, yes. This dual system of government gave the company immense financial power without any administrative responsibility, which led directly to corruption in the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1770.
Unbelievable. Now let's move to the new states, or insurgent states, those who actively rebelled against the Mughals. The Marathas are the major player here.
The Marathas, centered in the Deccan, were an organized resistance. They evolved into this vast expansionist confederacy under the Peshwas, their prime ministers. Their power peaked under Peshwa Balaji Rao, and their forces were successfully raiding as far north as Bengal.
They are credited with effectively ending Mughal military control over large swaths of India.
They are. But their expansion was famously halted in 1761.
The Third Battle of Panipat.
Yes, in 1761.
Yeah.
And they fought not against the Mughals, but against the Afghan invader, Ahmad Shah Abdali. The Marathas suffered devastating losses, and although they managed to recover their authority in the north within a decade, under Peshwa Madhav I.
The damage was done.
The defeat shattered their political unity. They fractured into 5 major regional houses, the Gaekwads, Holkars, Scindias, and so on, who frequently warred amongst themselves. This critically weakened their ability to oppose the eventual British challenge.
We also see the rise of the Jat state of Bharatpur, and the Sikh movement in Punjab transformed from a religious discipline into a political force.
That's right. The Sikhs organized into 12 decentralized military confederacies, or missals, in the second half of the 18th century. Their path toward a truly consolidated autonomous state was only completed under Maharaja Ranjit Singh at the very end of this period, who would establish the formidable Sikh Empire.
Finally, let's examine the independent states, those who benefited from the Mughal collapse but weren't directly governed by them, like Mysore.
Mysore, under the Wodeyar dynasty, was seized by the military adventurer Hyder Ali in 1761, and Hyder Ali and his son, Tipu Sultan, represent a key chronological anomaly.
How so?
They successfully modernized their state and military along European lines. They introduced concepts like new tax systems, state-owned industry, and even used sophisticated iron-cased rockets against the British.
Their entire timeline is just defined by perpetual conflict, isn't it, with the British and the Marathas?
Indeed. Hyder Ali fought the First Anglo-Mysore War and forced the British into a defensive alliance. He died during the Second War. Tipu Sultan continued the fight, but after the Third Anglo-Mysore War, he was forced into the humiliating Treaty of Seringapatam in 1792.
Where he lost half his territory.
He did, and the inevitable end came in 1799. Tipu was killed during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. His defeat secured British dominance in South India.
And we also have Travancore in Kerala.
Unified by Marthanda-Varma after 1729. His greatest chronological achievement was his victory over the Dutch East India Company at the Battle of Colishell in 1741, which effectively removed Dutch political power from the coast, a significant achievement for a native power.
So here is the key takeaway from this entire 18th century timeline. We see multiple powerful dynamic states emerge, the Marathas, Mysore, Hyderabad, all capable of imperial rule. So why did none of them succeed in establishing a replacement pan-Indian empire?
It comes down to fragmentation and internal conflict. The sources are definitive on this. These towers, particularly the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad, spent more time warring against each other than coordinating against the rising European power.
They consistently invited or allied with the British?
To gain a temporary advantage against a regional rival. This internal strife created the perfect chronological window for the East India Company to transition from a trading power to a political sovereign.
So that 18th century fragmentation facilitated the EIC's rise. This next section is all about that gradual, methodical encroachment, which culminates in the British Parliament using legislation to govern India.
The EIC, founded way back in 1600, was initially just a commercial entity. It was granted rights by the Mughals to establish trading posts or factories in places like Masupadandam and Surat. But the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and more importantly, the Battle of Buxar in 1764, changed everything.
Buxar granted them the Diwani rights, making them the de facto rulers of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa by 1773. But why did the British Parliament, located 5,000 miles away, feel the need to interfere with what was, essentially, a private company?
The immediate cause was financial disaster and political scandal. The EIC, despite controlling the immense wealth of Bengal, suffered a severe financial crisis by 1772. They were forced to beg Parliament for a massive £1 million loan.
And there was outrage back in Britain.
Huge outrage over the corruption of company officials and the absolute horrors of the Bengal famine of 1770. Parliament realized that a private company could not be trusted to govern a vast territory, and that initiated a period of constitutional control.
This sets the stage for a whole timeline of legislative acts. The first is the Regulating Act of 1773.
This act had 2 clear objectives: centralization and accountability. It was the very first time the British government formally asserted control over the EIC's affairs in India. It created the post of Governor-General of Bengal. Warren Hastings was the first, and gave him authority over Bombay and Madras.
And it also established an executive council.
A 4-member council, yes. A mechanism designed to prevent the Governor-General from becoming an absolute autocrat.
The legislative framework continues, slowly but surely eroding the company's power. We jump forward now to the Charter Act of 1813.
This was a critical step in opening India to direct British economic influence. It ended the EIC's monopoly on Indian trade, with the exception of tea and the China trade.
And this was driven by the Industrial Revolution in Britain?
Exactly. British manufacturers wanted direct access to Indian markets and raw materials. It just shows how commercial pressures were driving constitutional change.
The next act is arguably the most pivotal constitutional transformation before 1857, the Charter Act of 1833.
This act fundamentally changed the EIC's nature. The company ceased all commercial activities entirely. It transformed from a company with political power into a purely administrative body, acting solely as the agent of the British Crown.
A complete institutional metamorphosis.
It was. And this act also ramped up centralization, creating the Governor-General of India. Lord William Bentinck was the first. With this title change, the Governor-General in Council gained the exclusive power to legislate for all of British India.
And a law member was added to the council.
To professionalize the process, yes. Famously, Lord Macaulay. This marked the definitive beginning of centralized, all-India legislation, replacing the patchwork of local laws.
The final Charter Act before the Great Upheaval was the Charter Act of 1853.
This one formalized the separation of the executive and legislative functions. It created a distinct legislative wing, extended to 12 members that operated using parliamentary-style procedures, public debates, questions, responses. Our sources identify this as the very first embryonic step toward a true parliamentary system in India.
And these legislative milestones coincided with massive military conquest, ensuring no native power could challenge the EIC. The Anglo-Maratha Wars are the chronological bookend to native resistance.
By defeating the Marathas in 1818, the British essentially secured their military dominance across the entire subcontinent south of the Sutlej River. They then systematically annexed the remaining powerful kingdoms, like Sindh in 1843 and Punjab between 1849 and 1856. By the 1850s, the EIC's dominance was complete, yet the very mechanisms of this expansion, especially the doctrine of lapse, generated catastrophic underlying grievances.
The sheer weight of those grievances exploded in 1857, the large-scale rebellion. What were the specific political mechanisms that led to this chronological explosion?
Well, beyond the ethnic gulf between officers and troops and the immediate trigger of the rifle cartridges, the primary political grievance was annexation. The EIC, particularly under Governor-General Dalhousie, used the doctrine of lapse.
And what was that exactly?
It was a policy that mandated that if an allied native ruler died without a direct male heir, his territory would be annexed by the company. This policy was deeply destabilizing, and it led to the annexation of major kingdoms like Satara and Jhansi, stripping away the legitimacy of the company in the eyes of the remaining princely states.
The 1857 revolt, though it was brutally suppressed, led to a singular constitutional consequence: the Government of India Act, 1858.
This act immediately transferred all governing power from the East India Company directly to the British Crown. It dissolved the company entirely. This ushered in the era of the British Raj, from 1858 to 1947.
And the governance structure was immediately overhauled.
Completely. The post of Governor-General became the Viceroy, representing the monarch, and the Secretary of State for India was created in London to handle accountability to the British Parliament.
Under the Raj, massive infrastructural projects were implemented, defining the late 19th century chronology.
The government strengthened administrative infrastructure, codifying laws like the Indian Penal Code. They also prioritized practical administration over education, though English instruction had been implemented as early as 1835.
And the most visible chronological achievement was the railway system.
Oh, absolutely. By the late 19th century, India had built the world's fourth largest railway system. It was a huge mobilization of capital and labor, although, this infrastructure was primarily designed to move raw materials to ports and transport troops.
However, this period of development was constantly punctuated by famine and disease. Our sources make it clear that the colonial period saw some of the deadliest recorded famines.
It's a tragic feature of this chronological era. You have the Great Famine of 1876-1878 and the horrific Bengal Famine of 1943. While famines occurred throughout Indian history, critics note that colonial policies like exporting grain during shortages or prioritizing railway freight for export over local distribution often exacerbated the death toll.
And we also have to mention the plague.
The third plague pandemic in the mid-19th century. It alone claimed over 10 million lives in India.
As the 20th century begins, the timeline is increasingly dominated by global conflicts and the rising tide of nationalism. India's contribution to World War I was massive.
It was. Over 800,000 Indians volunteered for the army, and over 74,000 died fighting for the British Empire in places like France, Mesopotamia, and East Africa. This wartime sacrifice raised expectations for political concessions upon return.
Expectations that were largely dashed.
They were, and this disappointment fueled the nationalist movement. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, became the principal vehicle for independence, especially after 1920, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi.
The movement utilized nonviolent civil disobedience, which rapidly shifted the chronology of political struggle from elite lobbying to mass mobilization.
It did, and the British responded with successive constitutional reforms, like the Government of India Act of 1935, which incrementally introduced local self-governance while retaining ultimate British control.
The final great global conflict was World War II, where over 2.5 million volunteer soldiers fought for the British. This time, the war directly reached Indian soil.
It did. Japan invaded neighboring Burma by 1942, and the Indian National Army, formed with Japanese support, actively fought against the British, reaching as far as Kohima and Imphal in 1944. The war dramatically weakened Britain, financially and politically, creating the chronological inevitability of independence.
Which brings us to the final act. Independence and partition in August 1947.
The final constitutional transfer of power resulted in the partition of the British Indian Empire into the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. This was one of the largest and quickest transfers of sovereignty in global history.
And it caused one of the largest mass migrations ever recorded.
12 million people moving across newly drawn borders amid widespread violence that left an estimated 500,000 dead. It was a complex and catastrophic end to this massive, massive timeline.
We have covered such a profound stretch of time, moving from scattered hunter-gatherers to the highly organized, modern nation-state.
The scope truly reveals a pattern, doesn't it? If you chart this entire chronology, history in the subcontinent is defined by these recurring periods of radical collapse. The scattering of the IVC population due to drought, the Mauryan political fragmentation, the collapse of the Delhi Sultanate after Timur,
and the utter failure of centralized Mughal authority after 1707.
Exactly. And the incredible insight revealed by our source material is that these collapses rarely led to just chaos. They often led to a regional refoundation.
The rise of the Mahajanapadas, the dynamism of the Sangam period, or the powerful regional states of the 18th century.
And what's fascinating from a political timeline perspective is the persistence of symbolic legitimacy. Even when the Mughals were militarily defunct after 1707 and reduced to British pensioners by the late 18th century, newly autonomous states still looked to the emperor's sanction to legitimize their own rule. That symbolic authority was the last thing to die.
So the true chronological break wasn't achieved by a local victor on a battlefield, but by a legal maneuver, the moment that symbolic source of authority transferred constitutionally.
First through the East India Company's legislative steps, the 1773 and 1833 Charter Acts, and finally, irrevocably, to the British Crown with the Government of India Act in 1858.
And that leaves us with one final thought for you, the listener, as you reflect on this massive chronological journey. We've detailed how, in the pivotal 18th century, numerous powerful regional states, the Marathas, Mysore, Hyderabad, the Sikhs, all rose to prominence.
They were strong enough to replace the Mughals, yet the sources reveal that their failure to consolidate, their consistent internal warfare, and failure to unite against a common foreign threat created the singular opportunity for a foreign commercial power to become the sovereign.
So if you consider the entire history we just covered, from 73,000 BCE to 1947, when was the one most avoidable moment of fragmentation that irrevocably changed the subcontinent's course?
The 18th century's internal strife, which paved the way for foreign dominion, it really stands out as a stark historical warning.
A deeply relevant question that forces us to look beyond mere dates and focus on political choice. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.